This garden tour is for you, Mom. It's nearing mid-June of 2023, and this is our garden's third year. We aim to build 1 or 2 new beds each year. Our soil is primarily rocky and sandy, which is great for drainage, but terrible for water retention in an arid climate. So we start each bed by digging a trench, 1 foot deep, more or less, extracting the rocks as we go and setting them aside to line the edges of the bed. Into the trench goes organic matter, a sprinkling of compost, a dusting of minerals, but mostly lots of punky wood gathered from the slash piles left behind from when our property was logged, maybe sometime in the 80s. The decomposing wood adds a massive dose of organic matter to the bed that acts as a sponge, retaining water. After lining the new bed with rocks, we dump the native soil back on top of the punky wood and wet it all down, then cover that exposed soil with a layer of cardboard. The cardboard is a super mulch, protecting the soil from erosion, suppressing weeds, retaining water, and the worms love it too. On top of the cardboard, we spread 1 to 2 inches of partially decomposed compost, primarily to disguise the cardboard and also to continue feeding and protecting the soil while we retain water. You'd be surprised how quickly the cardboard disappears though. Finally, we poke holes through those top layers of mulch and drop in the inaugural plants for that bed, and then we're off. So far, this strategy, although labor-intensive up front, is working exactly as we hoped it would, creating a no-dig, low-maintenance bed with increasingly loamy soil that retains moisture. And the initial labor input slows us down, allowing us to develop our garden at a sustainable pace that's in step with infrastructure development and our available time, as well as the evolution of our creative vision for this space. Here we are at the service gate, the gateway we open and pass through daily. New this year, we've tacked on sections of cattle panels to our gateways and added vining plants that will eventually arc over those portals. Planted this spring, we have hardy kiwi vines, a male at the west gate, a female at the service gate, and another female between them. If these plants mature to fruition, the females will produce hairless, grape-sized fruits that are rumored to taste similar to pineapple. Along the north edge is a perennial bed of asparagus, strawberries, and pansies. Interplanted for the summer are tomatoes, which are said to repel asparagus beetle. And in this garden bed, we have a variety of spring-sown crops, the lettuces, cilantro, fava beans, mustards, and Asian greens, and spring onions. Lately, as I find time, I interplant a small army of zucchini that will take over this bed for the summer. There's also an abundance of nettle growing here. About 10 years ago, I found a small patch of wild nettle growing in a relatively wet spot we call the pond garden. I propagated more nettle from cuttings to start a colony in my temporary garden beds, and I'm so glad I did because the wild patch in the pond is succumbing to grass invasion. All of the nettles in our garden are volunteers from that initial propagation effort I made, and I tend to let them do their own thing, only cutting them out of the way when I need the space. Because nettle is a highly nutritious, even medicinal food source that crops up early in the spring, is easy to dehydrate for use as a winter vegetable, and it's great for the soil. But I'm getting distracted. In the next bed over, we have fava beans, which you helped me plant in April. They're flowering now, which the bees absolutely love, and you'd be surprised at their lovely, delicate fragrance. These beans will mature for pickling and for dry beans to consume in the winter. In between, we have winter squash that's just getting going and wishing I would find the time to hack back the mallow that's encroaching on their space. I've had a hard time letting go of the mallow because it's also an edible weed that I keep pecking away at for meals and intend to harvest and dry en masse for the winter. And I just love the green seed pods added to egg dishes, and those are just coming in now. On the other side of the bed, we have sugar snap peas and more winter squash. The peas are just about ready to grab hold of the jute twine trellis and take off, but they're looking a bit rough now because a young ground squirrel recently snuck into the garden and discovered their tender leaves. Across the main aisle, we have a heavily mulched bed of fall-planted garlic and spring-planted potatoes. I planted the garlic extra thick so I could thin them during the spring to enjoy as green garlic. And now the flower scapes are coming in, which we'll snap off while they're still tender and enjoy with dinner for a week or so. Off to the side, we have a new bed with 2 related varieties of black currants. Bare roots were just planted this spring. Beneath and around them will grow English thyme and peppermint and a spot of borage. And while this bed is still open and sunny, we'll take advantage of that to grow some more winter squash and hopefully some mini cantaloupes and Thai basil. Across the main aisle, we have the bed you helped us prepare this spring, thank you, with the yosta berry bushes finally in their forever home. underplanted with German thyme and strawberries, and of course some volunteer nettle in the mix, and their neighbors Mr. Hardy kiwi and some bee balm. And beyond that, we've just expanded our perimeter beds, starting with this strip of low-growing wild strawberries. And beyond that, we expanded our perimeter beds, starting with this strip of low-growing wild blueberries just planted this spring. Here we're passing by the raspberry and comfrey nursery, a temporary raised bed where we're keeping these plants until we can build them their forever homes. Each of those nurseries we started from just a plant or two given to us from friends or neighbors. Passing along the main aisle, we have a sunny bed that we just built last year. The main feature of this bed will be the English lavender that I started from seed 2 years ago, and I surprised myself with how successful that experiment went. The plants just went in the ground last spring, and a number of them are looking especially healthy and well established and preparing to flower for the first time, which is exciting. Interplanted with them this year, we have some leftover bulbs of onions from our friend's farm. This is an heirloom variety that will produce viable seeds for us this year. Between the onions, we have some potatoes, just because it doesn't hurt to grow more potatoes if you have an extra spot open. In keeping with the Mediterranean theme inspired by the lavender, there's marjoram, which can only grow as an annual here, but I've decided I enjoy its flavor enough that it's worth it to start them from seed each year. But I'm hoping that they'll start to self-seed. I've also given the oregano and rosemary a home here, as well as some orange spice thyme, a couple of miscellaneous winter squash because I needed the space, and I'm really excited about this little plant called, I think, agastache, or its common name is nettle leaf giant hyssop. I harvested the seeds from wild plants growing alongside the trail in the mountains last summer. Even though the plants were just dried flower heads by that time, their aroma was so incredibly powerful and intoxicating, I decided to bring the seeds home to see if I could replicate that mountain treat here in my garden. Along the eastern fence, we're extending the perimeter beds with the same pattern as the north perimeter, a community of asparagus, strawberries, and tomatoes. The asparagus is further along here, as I've started these plants from seed about 5 years ago now, tended them in a temporary garden, and then we transplanted them here last spring to their forever home. At the main gateway, this is what we'd consider to be our formal entry to the garden, which will open when we have guests visiting, for example. We've planted a climbing rose called Summer Wine. Planted just last spring, we're delighted to see it survive the winter and is establishing a home here. Summer Wine is a large, wild-looking flower that is supposed to produce rose hips, which is what I'm really after here. It's rose hip foraging for a lazy woman, because the wild roses are spread out and they make really tiny hips, sized somewhere between a pea and a marble. I like to cut the hips in half and scoop out the hairy seeds, so the dried hips are ready to enjoy as a culinary ingredient, like my favorite, rose hip and hot pepper jam. My hope is that the domestic rose will give me bigger hips, more return for my time investment when preparing this luxury ingredient. And finally, we come to the front corner of the garden, most visible from the front of the house, which I call my cottage garden. The original vision for this spot, which we just began developing last summer, is to grow showy natives and other plants here that thrive with minimal care and hopefully self-sow. As you approach from the formal gateway, we have native goldenrod, which I've been watching struggle to survive in the driveway for about a decade, and finally relocated to this more hospitable forever home here in the garden, where they're thriving once again. I hope to see them flower for the first time this year. Next up is hyssop, which I started from seed maybe 5 years ago, transplanted from a temporary garden spot last year, and it's thriving now in its new home. Then we have what will ultimately be a row of showy flowers. I'm working on getting pansies established and self-sowing along the edges, alongside garlic chives, which have been surprisingly slow to grow here. A couple of hollyhocks are trying to get by, and I'll continue planting zinnias and poppies each year, hoping they'll start to self-sow on their own. The zinnia babies are temporarily protected by cones because cutworms, the larvae of moth, seem to really enjoy zinnia seedlings. This year I'm planting my tulsi, also known as holy basil, in this bed, hoping they'll take off as they have for me in the past to create a luscious ground cover that the bees absolutely adore. In this corner we have a bed of French sorrel, chamomile, and orange mint. This all should fill in another week or two. Alongside the greenhouse, we have a couple of daylilies, which you can barely see, just planted last year and getting established now. This is an edible lily that produces a lovely orange flower. Beside the lilies are hops, also in their first true year. I'm training them up a jute trellis to shade the greenhouse during the summer. Hops die back to the soil every winter, but they grow at such a fast rate that I'm literally winding their tips around the twine twice a day. Say that 10 times fast. At the end of the growing season, when the hops go dormant, my plan is to just snip that hop-covered twine off at the eye hooks and dump it all into the compost pile. Easy peasy. Here we have our firstborn rhubarb, grown from seed maybe 7 years ago now, and transplanted to its forever home here just last year. She has a slightly different quality to her than the younger sisters, also grown from seed a year or two after her. She's darker and a little slower, but I'm happy to see she's coming back just as strong as ever this year. Around here in the front, we have white sage, or prairie sage, a native. It's considered a sacred plant in some traditions, used for smudging, for example. It grows naturally on our property. Its population even seems to be increasing since we've settled down here and fenced out the cattle. But I just wanted to give it a protected and permanent space of honor in our garden because I hope it will always be around. The rest of this bed currently looks to be in rough shape, but it will fill in over the next few weeks and get better with age. Here we'll have a permanent and protected bed space for lupins and for a wild buckwheat that was rescued from the driveway. In my garden, I share space with the native yarrow, which is so incredibly potent that I've decided as a rule that I'm not going to grow any other varieties of yarrow here because I don't want to risk watering down the gene pool with showy but less medicinal plants. Just getting started on this perimeter, we have a bunch of pepper and basil starts that will love this sunny spot, and some self-sown calendula that are about to take off, as well as runner beans that I hope will finally thrive in this spot, climbing up this fence and enjoying the sunlight here. At the corner is a blue jean baby Russian sage, which I'm told thrives effortlessly in our region. It remains to be seen. This little guy was planted just last summer, and I'm relieved to see that it has finally emerged from its winter dormancy in the last couple of weeks. In the middle of the cottage garden is the true centerpiece, our lilac bush. Lilacs are a mainstay of homesteads here. It seems like just about everyone has at least one lilac bush, and long after a house has been abandoned or razed, lilacs continue growing there as a reminder of the homestead that used to be. This lilac is of special sentimental value to us as we propagated it from a small sucker taken from Janet and Trig's Mountain View homestead, right before they sold and relocated to the valley and shortly before Trig passed away. We buried a bit of Trig's ashes here when we planted the lilac in its forever home after spending a couple of years tending it, barely keeping it alive, in a temporary location before the garden was born. The lilac is wearing a skirt of strawberries and dotted with garlic and green onion and of course some volunteer nettle, and I'm trying to get a bed going of perennial flowers like echinacea and rudbeckia. This year I seem to finally have success with the echinacea, only to have the previously thriving rudbeckia mysteriously disappear, and now I'm starting all over again with them. And also getting a nursery bed going for spearmint here in the shade of the lilac. And last but not least, we have our wine barrel beds in front of the house. They're heavy from rain at the moment, but until recently we had a tall stand of chives with pink pom-pom flowers, all abuzz with a variety of native bees. It amazes me that this small army of chives in front of the house and standing sentinel around edges of beds in the garden all started from a single plant given to me by a friend about 7 years ago. Now I have more chives than I know what to do with, it seems, but they grow effortlessly here and serve as an edible ornamental that the pollinators adore. Normally the wine barrel beds would be filled with a variety of mints that enjoy the afternoon shade in front of the house. But the mints don't seem to have survived this past winter. They haven't returned yet. Not even my usually robust barrel of bee balm has returned, which is unusual. I noticed the mints were struggling to return last year, which is why I'm starting a new strategy in the garden of keeping mints in various nursery locations from which I can harvest divisions to plant up in the barrels each year. For now, we have a second round of lettuces and herbs starting here, which should be reaching their prime here in the shade of the house when the garden bed lettuces may begin to bolt in the summer heat. And there you have it, our first garden tour. I'm sure it was way more in-depth than you were asking for, Mom, but it was a pleasure to take some time out from my day-to-day grind to reflect on the progress we've made and appreciate the garden while it's thriving in the warm, wet days of spring. Thank you for inspiring me and motivating me to go on this journey with you. Lots of love, Kristen.